This episode of Toy Time is brought to you by Dawn Gilchrist. Miss Gilchrist is the 2020 Burroughs Wellcome Fund Western Teacher of the Year. She teaches in Jackson County Public Schools. In this video, Miss Gilchrist takes you on a wonderful writing journey. One of the great things about writing right now is that you don't need a computer, you don't need to connect to the internet. All you need is a sheet of paper, a pencil, and your own thoughts. In this video, Miss Gilchrist will teach you all about how to write a personal memoir. Have fun and happy writing.
Good morning. I'm Dawn Gilchrist, and I am the Burroughs Wellcome Fund 2020 Western Region Teacher of the Year. And I'm going to do a lesson this morning on how to write a mini memoir. And it's certainly language arts oriented, but anyone could do it. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge a couple of things. First, I got this lesson from a wonderful college professor that I had, Dr. Jim Addison, and he taught for the Mountain Writing Project. And this is a very creative writing activity, even though it is based on factual event or events. And I also want to acknowledge that this entire series of teaching videos is the idea of Mariah Morris, and she is the 2019 Burroughs Wellcome Fund North Carolina Teacher of the Year, and she is doing wonderful work. I feel very fortunate to be part of the group that's producing these videos. I hope that you'll enjoy this, and I want to show you the part of the state that I'm from, if I can get this other computer screen to show up without too much of a glare. So if you look at that map, I am from the far western region of the state, and I live here in the mountains. It's beautiful here today, a little chilly. We're having what's called dogwood winter. The dogwoods bloom, and we always have a cold snap, and then usually in May, when the blackberries are blooming, we have another cold snap, and we call that one Blackberry Winter. So if I were going to write a memoir about the events that are going on now, the COVID-19 pandemic, and what's happening in my life as a result, then I might start my memoir by talking about dogwood winter. But we will see what you want to do with yours. And so in just a moment, we'll begin with the actual activity. However, first I want to tell you the difference in a memoir and an autobiography, because they are frequently confused. Actually, they're interchangeable. I wouldn't say confused. A memoir can be about just an event or a few events in a person's life. An autobiography is about a person's entire life. Most autobiographies are written about famous people, although not all. Memoirs and autobiographies share that they are first-person narratives, and they also share that they reveal what's going on with people internally in response to events that are going on outside. However, a memoir really focuses on this. So English teachers might call this kind of an internal landscape that comes through more in memoirs than it does in autobiographies. So you can write more about how you feel about what things are going on, which would make a mini memoir ideal for writing about what's going on with you while you are stuck at home and the world around you is changed, at least for some time. Okay, we understand all of that. So before we move on to the activity, just let me say, and this is for English teachers, I don't think students would be very interested in this, but the North Carolina standards that this activity covers are writing standards, 9th grade through 10th grade, 9 through 10.3, and 11th through 12th grade, 11 through 12.3. All right then, we'll begin. In order to create something that comes alive for your reader on the page, you need to approach your writing of your mini memoir by first of all trying to remember as many details as you can about what it is you're going to write about. A really good way to do this, and this is the way that I learned in the class that I took with Dr. Addison, is to first of all create an image of the place where the memory primarily occurs. In the example that I'm going to give you, I'm going to show you a drawing that I did, and I'm not a bad drawer, but you don't have to be a good drawer at all to do this activity. But the one that I'm going to show you took place when I was a child. The image I'm going to show you is from a memory that took place when I was a child, and so it is an old memory, so I really have to go back and, as much as possible, revisit that place. A good way to do it is by drawing what I remember, only of the place. So here's the drawing that I did. It says mini memoir scaffolding, memory of place, because that's where you begin. And you should use all 5 of your senses in remembering. So I think you might be able to tell, but this is a front porch of a house. And it's an unfinished front porch. It was cement, and there was a window, and there was a door that you can see, and there were trees at one end, and it was summertime. And if I were going to really focus on the primary part of the memory, it was these steps that went down to a basement. And since the porch was not finished, it didn't have a rail on it of any sort. And the steps went down about 8 feet to the concrete floor of the basement. So if I were going to use all 5 of my senses to recreate this place, then I would say what I saw while I was there was the green of summer, the trees at the end of the porch. There was a bush at the end of the porch growing right up against it. I saw the porch itself. I saw the yard in front. I saw my one little brother and one little sister who were running, and I held my youngest brother. What did I smell? I would have smelled what my mother and her friend were doing inside. They were making blackberry jam, and we could smell it as it cooked, and then as they poured it into the jars. I could have also smelled the flowers. I could have probably also smelled the fragrance of freshly cut hay, because we were on a friend's farm. And what I could hear would have been my younger siblings' laughter and their shouts as they ran and jumped. And I could have also heard my mother and her friend talking inside. What I could have tasted, probably nothing, but I certainly could have imagined the taste of blackberry jam when we put it on hot biscuits with butter. What could I have felt? I would have felt the warmth of my little brother whom I was holding. I would have felt the heat of the air, because it was most likely July. And I would have also felt the coolness of the concrete porch beneath my feet. And I think that's probably good for using my senses to remember. And I would keep this in mind as I began writing. To come up with this memory, though, if you need a prompt, you could just say, what is a memory that has stuck with me that in some way, you could say, what is a memory that has taught me something? You could say, what is a memory that I would want to tell my friends or someday tell my children? And so that's how you can begin, by creating an image that allows you to once more see the place where the event you're going to write about occurred. What I'd like to do now is give you an example of an excerpt from a memoir. It is one written by the British colonialist writer Beryl Markham, and she wrote this wonderful memoir called West with the Night, and it is about her experiences in Kenya in East Africa when she was a child, living there with her father, who was also British. And in this particular one, she's writing about, in this particular excerpt, she's writing about visiting a friend's farm, and I believe the owner of the farm was called Elkington. And the title of the chapter this is in is called He Was a Good Lion, which gives you a pretty good idea of what's happening, or maybe what might happen. Beryl Markham is most famous, if not for this memoir, then for the fact that she was the first person to fly solo from east to west across the Atlantic Ocean. So she was quite an adventurous person. Here is one of her adventures as a child, and pay attention to how many of the senses she uses in recreating this event. Here it is. Why I ran at all, or with what purpose in mind, is beyond my answering. But when I had no specific destination, I always ran as fast as I could in the hope of finding one, and I always found it. I was within 20 yards of the Elkington lion before I saw him. He lay sprawled in the morning sun, huge, black-maned, and gleaming with life. His tail moved slowly, stroking the rough grass like a knotted rope end. His body was sleek and easy, making a mold where he lay, a cool mold that would be there when he had gone. He was not asleep, he was only idle. He was rusty red and soft, like a strokable cat. I stopped, and he lifted his head with magnificent ease and stared at me out of yellow eyes. I stood there staring back, scuffling my bare toes in the dust, pursing my lips to make a noiseless whistle, a very small girl who knew about lions. And she calls the lion Paddy. He was kind of a pet for the Elkington family. Paddy raised himself then, emitting a little sigh, and began to contemplate me with a kind of quiet premeditation, like that of a slow-witted man fondling an unaccustomed thought. I cannot say that there was any menace in his eyes, because there wasn't, or that his frightful jowls were drooling, because they were handsome jowls and very tidy. He did sniff the air, though, with what impressed me as being close to audible satisfaction, and he did not lie down again. I remembered the rules that one remembers. I did not run. I walked very slowly, and I began to sing a defiant song. Kali koma simbasisi, I sang. Asikari yoti nu udari. Fierce like the lion are we, Askari, all are brave. I went in a straight line past Paddy when I sang it, seeing his eyes shine in the thick grass, watching his tail beat time to the meter of my ditty. What lion would be unimpressed with the marching song of the King's African Rifles? Singing it still, I took up my trot toward the rim of the low hill which might, if I were lucky, have Cape gooseberry bushes on its slopes. The country was gray-green and dry, and the sun lay on it closely, making the ground hot under my bare feet. There was no sound, and no wind. Even Paddy made no sound, coming swiftly behind me. What I remember most clearly of the moment that followed are three things: a scream that was barely a whisper, a blow that struck me to the ground, and as I buried my face in my arms and felt Paddy's teeth close on the flesh of my leg, a fantastically bobbing turban that was Bishan Singh's turban appear over the edge of the hill. And so this is a friend who has seen what has happened and who is coming behind her quickly. I remained conscious, but I closed my eyes and tried not to be. It was not so much the pain as it was the sound. The sound of Paddy's roar in my ears will only be duplicated, I think, when the doors of hell slip their wobbly hinges one day and give voice and authenticity to the whole panorama of Dante's poetic nightmares. It was an immense roar that encompassed the world and dissolved me in it. I shut my eyes very tight and lay still under the weight of Patty's paws. And so you can see in that excerpt that she has recreated a scene from memory using her senses, and it is quite a scene. Perhaps we don't have anything like that to write about, or perhaps we do, but we have our own memories that are worth writing down. The next step that you need to take in preparing to actually write your mini memoir is still part of the scaffolding, just like recreating the image of the place. This one is a little less creative. It's a little more factual. And that is, think of the memory you're going to write about again, and this time write down the people or animals that are involved, or perhaps even trees or bodies of water, or in an urban area, the city block. The people for me were my younger sister, my two brothers, one was a baby, and my mother. And then also you want to remember what took place, but how you would like to recreate what took place. And with mine, my time and structure would be, I'm going to write mine chronologically, but then I am going to have a flash forward at the end. So it will be this childhood memory, but then at the end, I'm going to come to the place where I am now as an adult and give my reader an idea of where the people who were part of the memory, where they actually are now. And so the next thing that we do after this will be to remember the entire event. And so what I'm going to do next is I'm going to do a verbal recreation of the event, and I'm going to tell it in the same way that I would write it. Not because that's how you should do it, although you can do it that way, but because there is really no way that I can show you how to do this without saying it. And if I write it down and show you what I've written, it would be a lot more tedious. Here is my story, my mini memoir. I'm going to begin right now, where I am at this time in my life. I'm going to tell it chronologically, and then I'm going to do a flash forward, which would be back to the present. Here's the story. Today is April 1st, 2020, and we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic. Many of us are at home because we know that it is the safest thing to do for ourselves and others. And on this particular day in my home, I am upstairs in my adult daughter's bedroom. She's not here. She's far away in a different state. And outside, it's cold here in the mountains. It is what we call dogwood winter. The dogwoods are blooming, and we typically have a 3 or 4 day cold snap during this period of time. Our next winter, in the middle of spring, will be Blackberry Winter, and that's when the blackberries bloom in May, and we'll have 2 or 3 days of chilly weather then, and then we'll have full-blown late spring and summer. But this dogwood and blackberry winter remind me of when I was a child and the blackberries had already bloomed, and blackberries had already formed on the blackberry brambles throughout the mountains. We had picked those blackberries, and then my mother and a friend of hers were going to make blackberry jam in her friend's kitchen. I was babysitting, taking care of my younger 3 siblings. I had an older sibling also, but she was away at a camp for gifted children. I was not, however. I was taking care of the young ones while my mom worked to prepare food for the next winter. So I was on the porch. The porch was not finished at our friend's house. It was at the Johnson's house. They were still working on it. They had not put a rail around the porch, and the porch itself was made of cement, and it had steps that went down to the basement, about 8 feet down to the basement, to a cement floor. And that's where the Johnsons would have stored all of their canned goods, like the blackberry jam they were making. My youngest brother was afraid of the Johnsons' big dog, and so I was holding him. He was about 2. My other younger brother and sister were 7 and 4, and they were Camille and Robert Dwayne, and I was holding Shane. Camille and Robert Dwayne were running on the porch as fast as they could, and then they were jumping off the edge into the soft grass. And each time that they did this, they backed up a few steps and then took a running leap into the grass. And I was carrying the youngest one around, carrying Shane around, and he was definitely afraid of the dog, and so I was trying to hold him and also pay attention to the other 2. But I would have been about 11 or 12. I noticed that Camille and Robert Dwayne were getting a little bit too close to the edge of where the steps went down to the basement, but I noticed a little too late. My brother Robert Dwayne took one step too many backward, and all I remember was seeing the flash of his small self as he went down the side and landed with a pretty terrible sound on the bottom step. I called my mother immediately, and I can remember my brother Robert Dwayne not making a sound, my little sister Camille, yelling and crying, and my youngest brother in my arms, not knowing what was happening and just watching, but I could feel him up against me. And I also remember at this time that I could still smell the blackberry jam that they were cooking in the kitchen. When my mother heard me call, and I'm sure she heard me call in a voice that could have only been laden with panic, she came running out. I think she immediately knew what had happened, ran down to the bottom of the steps, picked up my little brother, whose body was not moving, and she carried him up the steps and ran to our car, and she told our friend, Mrs. Johnson, to get the rest of us home, and she left, going to the hospital to take my youngest brother. And I remember Mrs. Johnson just standing there, aghast. I remember the fragrance of the blackberry jam coming from the kitchen. I remember the softness of the summer air, because it was probably July, and I remember my little sister crying and my other little brother just not knowing what was happening. And I remember the weight of his little body up against mine. I loved my little brothers and my little sister, and I wanted to keep them safe, and it was always a comfort to have them there with me. Mrs. Johnson took us home, and we didn't have telephones here in this part of the country, most of us at that time, but I remember my dad coming home from work and finding out what had happened, and then my younger siblings and I stayed with a great aunt while my dad and my mom went to the hospital and stayed with my younger brother. During that period of time, I remember a number of things that happened, but none of them have the importance or have had the impact on my memory of that one moment when my youngest brother fell and the sound that he made when he hit the cement floor. Now here's the flash forward. That brother is just fine. He is now 50 years old, and he has 4 children, and they are all healthy, and he is healthy. He still has pretty bad headaches, because what happened to him was he fractured his skull, and it was a bad fracture from here all the way down to the base of his neck. But because my mother got him to the hospital quickly, he was in the hospital about 2 weeks, but he survived. And I remember when he came home, he was just this little boy with the biggest black eyes underneath each eye that I had ever seen. But he made it. And so that is my mini memoir. And if I wrote it, I would add a number of other details, and I would go back and I would revise, and I would look back at the picture that I drew of the place where the event happened, and I would look back at my list of people and I would add details that would bring it even more to life on the page. You now know the initial steps in getting your story down. It's all about coming up with a memory that means something to you, that you want to tell, and that you want to encapsulate in written form. So the first step is come up with your memory that you're going to make into a mini memoir. Draw the setting in which the memory occurred and use all 5 senses as you're drawing so that you can remember when you begin writing. And then after that, you need to determine who else was in that memory with you, who else or what else, and list those. Decide on what structure you're going to use. Are you going to tell it in chronological order? Are you going to use flashbacks and flash forwards? And then after you've done that, write it down as best you can, put it aside, wait at least 24 hours, and then go back and reread it and add details, specific details that are imagery, that are sense-oriented, 5 senses oriented. And then after you've done that, get someone or several someones to read it, people preferably who did not experience the memory with you, so that you can get an objective view on what it is you've conveyed to them in telling your story. And then after you get some feedback from some people, then go through it again and make sure it's exactly the way you want it, polish it, and then after that, the sky's the limit. What might you do with your story? What might we all do with these stories? The stories that we were right now, that we are in the midst of during this very different time in all of our lives. And all of our stories, I think, are going to be worth hearing. And when we come together again in classrooms and in groups of people who can again meet and hug one another, I think we will have a great many stories to tell. Perhaps this will be part of the story that you tell, this experience during this time. Thank you so much.